So I hope you're now seeing the Slido screen. And Leela, looks like you're up first. There are some remnant elms in the forests of the Arrowhead region up in far northeastern Minnesota, but it would be difficult to find forest-grown elms more than 22 inches DBH in northeast Minnesota due to low productivity. It's a great question. Would you be interested in smaller elms in this region?
So I'm going to have to punt that question to Linda Haugen, because she will be the person in your region who will actually be making these on the ground decisions. I would think we probably would want to capture the genetic diversity. So I would hope the answer is yes, but I suggest reaching out to Linda directly to ask her, because that'll be really her decision to make.
Great, thanks, Leela. And I'm pretty sure that Linda's contact information, I guess I'm not certain, appears on, yeah, you're nodding, on the enhanced abstract.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
you can find
it's
that.
there.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks, Leela. Okay, Leela, back to you again. What does resistance look like in the field trials?
Yeah, so we compare the canopy dieback, because that's the metric that we're looking at, is the percent of the canopy that is dying, is responding to the fungal pathogen. We compare that in our survivor elms or progeny from the survivor elms with our tolerant and susceptible controls. So that can vary tremendously from year to year, just depending on rainfall and climatic conditions. And even resistant trees will have canopy decline, but we're looking at the percent of the canopy that dies back, and following individual trees over a couple of years. And the tolerant controls that we're using, many of them, I think I mentioned, are commercially available. They're planted in urban areas, so they're really, they have to be very tolerant to withstand the harsh conditions of those sites. So I think it's a good metric, but we'll see over time how they hold up.
Thank you, Leela. Okay, I'll archive that one. Next up, question for Ron Moen. Ron, foresters are anecdotally seeing moose persist in northeast Minnesota, in northern Itasca, Koochiching, and western St. Louis counties. Climate is undoubtedly impacting moose in the state, but what can we learn from these persistent populations outside the core area, especially given that they are warmer and drier than the core moose range in Minnesota?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one of those things that I've known about them, and the survey, the reason the survey doesn't go wider than that is because those populations there's very few animals and they're in little pockets. So it's really not worth counting them, kind of like the Northwest Minnesota population. The other thing that I would say about that is that, it's not just the moose and climate. That's what we often hear about a lot. But when you look at, for example, moose in North Dakota and moose in Massachusetts, one of the common things that I've seen in those distributions is that there's basically they've lost their predators. And we still have wolves here, and essentially that's what's keeping the populations lower in those pockets. And not that I'm anti-wolf, but it's just a fact of biology. So.
Well, thanks, Ron. Looks like the next question is for you as well, about methods. What criteria did you use to assess likelihood of mammals moving into Minnesota? Also, is the decline in martens, fishers, and lynx largely predicated on loss of snowshoe hares or other reasons? If so, could they switch prey, especially considering these areas are warmer and drier?
Okay, lots of questions there. It's good that I can see them. The criteria that I used was kind of moving into, it was the potential to move per year. And that's why I said it's really potential, because we've modified the landscape so much. And when you think about especially the smaller animals like mice and shrews, it'll be hard for them to move, like essentially along roadside ditches and other things to get move further north. So I think that that's one of the things that we need to kind of look at a little bit more in the future, is dispersal probability, kind of like the assisted migration that we heard about earlier. Do we want to do that? And decline in martins, fishers, and lynx. I would say for martins and fishers, it is related in part to snowshoe hare loss. Lynx have never really been a kind of their population here in Minnesota is dependent on periodic immigration in from Ontario, the lynx hare cycle, and then when hares drop in Ontario and Manitoba, then we have an influx of lynx, and that's in part what keeps our population going. We do have records. The Superior National Forest has been working on this genetic record, so we're having reproduction and persistence of individuals, but we don't have a large populations. Martins and fishers do take other prey. Lynx are pretty much, we did a diet study on them, and it's consistent with other things, almost all snowshoe hare, a few grouse, and scavenging on like actually gut piles from deer hunters in the fall, and other dead animals too. But lynx would be the species that wouldn't switch prey. Martins and fishers they already have a more varied diet.
Thanks, Ron. Next question is for Katie. Seasonal ponds. Has anyone used LiDAR to identify seasonal ponds? If not, how do you find them on the landscape?
Yeah, I was actually just typing a response. So there's definitely been efforts to use LiDAR to map seasonal ponds. I put a citation in the chat, and I can add it to my page if that would be helpful. A remote sensing paper where they've used LiDAR. The Chippewa and the Superior National Forest use those methods to map potential ponds on their property, and then conduct field surveys to verify pond locations. And they mostly, spent the summer sending out technicians to walk, the potential pond locations. They use both biology and physical characteristics to identify the ponds. So they're using a combination of both, which I think is the best way to, map them all and not limit yourself.
Thank you. Next up is Ron. Is there a published paper or other resources on the wildlife climate change work?
There is. I'm just starting this actually, so it's something that I got a million things going on, and this is one of the new things that I kind of, as I'm ending my career, wanted to finish up with, is kind of mammals in Minnesota and what's going to happen to them. So it's not published yet. I do have plans, but I'm sure you know how that goes. There are papers on species specific, like the Myers one that I referenced, and also there's a recent paper that just came out on moose, for example. And I can put you in touch with those if you send me an email.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ron. Ron and maybe others, let's do, well, we got 5 minutes left, maybe a couple more questions. We currently may consider species such as moose, martins, etc., when making management decisions that'll affect a stand for another 40 or more years. If those species are unlikely to be present, what should we do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what is the planning horizon? And the other thing we don't know is what's going to happen to our forest 40 or 50 years from now. And I guess that if I were managing, like for moose, for example, it would depend. In Grand Portage area, where we know they're going to stick around for a while, I'd certainly be more inclined to keep them as a management focus. But if we look at southern St. Louis County, in the near term, yes, but in the longer term, they're probably not going to be sticking around.
I want to come back to that question, but let's hear from Zach. Great overview on the way watershed planning is supposed to work. Any comment on the difference between theory and the reality of Minnesota Pollution Control Agency? I think I got that wrong. Implementation, MPCA implementation. Tribes have been frustrated with MPCA's failure to list some impairments. Zach, any comments there?
I don't have a lot of comments. I'm not extremely familiar with all of the sort of internal, how the sausage is made at the PCA, so to speak. But I do know that in that intensive watershed monitoring portion of the planning, they don't look at every single water body in the watershed. I'm not sure how they prioritize them, and I would imagine if there's basically the gaps are filled by models. HSPF is a hydrologic model that I think, especially in the forested area, maybe makes some assumptions that doesn't quite fit our unique landscape. But I think that probably the way in which PCA could prioritize which water bodies actually have physically monitoring that go on, if there's, depending on stakeholder engagement with tribes, for example, there might be kind of a mismatch on what rivers they're actually taking samples in versus which ones they're relying on modeling to identify impairments. So they don't look at every single one, and that could have something to do with it, and that sometimes something can kind of slip by.
Zach, while you're there, so to clarify, there was a 30% increase in water yield in the Cowish after the Pecami Creek fire, but no increase in peak flows. Is that correct? And do we expect that increase to last 15 years or so as elsewhere?
So there was a 30% increase in water yield and no increase in peak flows. That's correct. But the increase in water yield only persisted for 5 years after the fire. And even then, there was only 1 year for which we were had real statistical confidence about. So that's to say that at this larger watershed level, the effect of even a large scale disturbance is much less pronounced than at a small scale. And that's partly because there's just a lot of different areas within the upper Cowish watershed for that extra water that's not being evapotranspired to kind of stash out. There are lots of lakes and wetlands, and that water kind of gets meted out over the course of several years versus all reaching the outlet of a very small watershed in 1 year. So that's part of that kind of fundamental difference between the small versus the large watersheds, is there are just more places for that water to get waylaid on its way to the outlet for a large river versus a small one.
Great. Thank you, Zach.